Hi, this is Bob Turner from the Pacific Northwest Wrestling Officials Association, and I want to describe a proposal for a change to Rule 5-17, which defines the start and end of a match. The reason for this change is the problem we're trying to solve is that start and end of match definition needs some refinement because there are some inconsistencies that can happen in applying the rules that could literally impact the result of a match, determining who wins and who loses. So why does it matter? Well, two referees could see the exact same scenario and declare different winners of the match versus their colleague, and both could point to the rules and be justified. Secondly, there's ambiguity about exactly when the match is started for a wrestler, and that just opens the door for some chaos and manipulation of rules to avoid penalties. And then the third reason it matters, there are a variety of situations where it's not clear how to apply the rules to get to the definitive match result. So the solution that I'm proposing is to revise Rule 5-17, get rid of this ambiguity, and codify some key principles into the rule that would yield consistent rulings and determine the true winner of the match. So let's start by talking about what the start of the match. There's a few key markers that we need to consider. One is whoever's first in the reporting order. In a dual meet, this is determined by a pre-meet disc toss, and this is the person that's supposed to report to the scores table first for that particular match. Then there's the second person in the reporting order for that pre-meet disc toss. And then we'll just call it what I call the committed marker, which is based on the reporting order. Then once the wrestler is no longer allowed to withdraw without losing by disqualification, that means they're committed to being in that match. So let's just give a quick illustration on reporting when it happens in the proper order. So first, Green approaches the table and reports in. Once they are reported in, they're committed. They can't be withdrawn because they were supposed to report first. Then Red heads to the table. When Red reports to the table, they're also committed and they cannot be withdrawn because now everybody's reported in the proper order. That's pretty straightforward. Illustration 2, though, let's show you what happens if they report in the reverse order. So by the toss, Green was required to report first, but Red gets to the table and reports in. Then Red goes to the center of the mat. Red can still be withdrawn at this point because they weren't required to report in yet. Green comes to the table now and reports, and they're committed because they were required to report first, so they can't be withdrawn at this point without losing by disqualification. Now, at this point, the coach, if they wanted to, for Red, might take out their first person they put on the mat, and let's say they replace them with Red person 2B. And now that 2B has been reported to the scores table, they can't be withdrawn at that point, so they're committed. So I've highlighted in the red hash mark there sort of the problematic time frame here. So between the time that the original Red wrestler reported in and then the person who the coach replaced him with reported in, we've got sort of a weird time frame, and I'll explain what the concern is in a few moments. The end of the match, there's some key markers that we need to be aware of. The first is when the victory has been earned. So this is the moment in time in which the wrestler has achieved the victory. Okay. Now, there's a separate moment in time sometimes, which is when the final result gets determined. So this can happen sometimes because, for instance, once somebody's earned a tech fall, if they've put their opponent directly into near fall criteria, they are allowed the opportunity to earn a pin. So they may have already earned the victory, and we still don't know what the final result is. So that's why it's potentially a separate marker in time. And then the third marker is when wrestling actually stops. So when the referee finally blows that final whistle to stop action. So these are three distinct and separate events, and they don't always occur simultaneously. So let me illustrate. First, let's show the easy example when all three markers occur simultaneously. So both shoulders get in contact with the mat. 2 seconds goes by with those shoulders in contact. That's a fall. At that moment in time, the victory has been earned, and the final result has also been determined. It's a fall, and the referee is blowing the whistle to stop the wrestling action. So this is the most straightforward and easy example. All three markers happen simultaneously. Now what happens in this illustration when the final result gets delayed? So we start out, it's the third period, they're in neutral position, and red leads 14-0. Next, red scores a takedown and takes the opponent straight into near fall criteria. At this moment, red leads 16-0. So our first marker has been achieved. The victory has been earned. This wrestler has already earned a tech fall. However, because he took the opponent into near fall criteria, wrestling continues. So let's say 15 seconds have passed in the pinning situation. And at that point, finally red earns a fall. So at that moment, the final result has been determined, and it's a fall, not a tech fall. We also have the third marker happening, which is the referee is blowing the whistle to stop wrestling action at that moment. So again, the red hash mark is, sort of the problematic time frame where certain things can happen that between the time somebody's earned the victory and by the time the final result has been determined and the referee stops action. And this would exist also in situations where a takedown and sudden victory goes straight into near fall criteria, or a reversal in the ultimate tiebreaker goes straight into near fall criteria. So the third illustration I'll give you is when there's a delayed stoppage. So this is an even more complex example. So let's say it's the start of the second period. Red is the defensive wrestler in the defensive starting position, and they lead 10-0. Start action, red reverses and puts the opponent into near fall criteria. At this moment, red leads 12-0. Red gets a 5 count in near fall criteria, and the pinning situation continues. And at this point, red has earned a 3-point near fall, even though it hasn't been awarded yet. So we've hit our first marker because red has earned the victory. They have earned a tech fall at this point. But because they're in near fall criteria, wrestling continues. So the wrestling is continuing, and suddenly green reverses red, and the wrestling mistakenly continues. The action should have stopped, but the referee didn't realize there was a tech fall, and lets action continue. So at this moment, though, the final result has been determined. It is a tech fall. Green's reversal isn't legitimate. The match is already over, and now we know that red should get a tech fall. But because the referee didn't blow the whistle, action continues. And then finally, because everybody's yelling from the bench and the table and trying to call attention to the referee, finally the ref realizes that a tech fall was earned. So now the referee blows the whistle to stop the action. Okay. Now our red hash time frame of concern, you can see from the time that the victory is earned until we finally stop the action. But inside of that is also an even more problematic time frame, which is where there is some bad time. So between marker 2 and 3, that wrestling action should have never happened, and now we have bad time. So let's take a look at the problematic time frames for a match. And this is where weird stuff can happen, right? So we saw those 3 different illustrations where that bad time or that problematic time could be happening at the start of the match, and then 2 of them where it was at the end of the match. So let's take the first one, which is at the start of the match when they report out of order. Here are some undesired things that the current rules would not prevent during a time frame where we put a wrestler on the mat who could be withdrawn. That wrestler, let's call them red A, and red B would be the person that ultimately is committed to wrestle. But red A, if they go out there, what happens if they get penalized? They get a technical violation or a stall warning. That penalty would get wiped away in this scenario because red B is the replacement for that person. Red A could get all the way to the handshake, and then the coach might say, hey, I'm withdrawing that kid, and pull him off and putting red B in, thus kind of wasting time and flouting the rule. And then the third bad thing that could happen is red A goes out to the mat and now needs some sort of charged timeout, like an injury timeout or a blood timeout or a head, neck, and cervical timeout. And that timeout would get wiped away again because red B replaces red A, and thus none of those things that would potentially get recorded on the score sheet against red A would stand. Let's take a look at the end of the match and some of those problematic time frames that we talked about. So in this situation where we had the tech fall earned, but the match continued until we finally earned a pinfall, here are some problematic things that the rules wouldn't provide a definitive decision on who wins or what the final result of the match would be. Imagine in this time frame, red has already earned the tech fall, but now red commits a flagrant misconduct during the pinning situation. If this was during a time frame where it was a takedown in sudden victory or a reversal in the ultimate tiebreaker, or red cries out for a third injury timeout during that time frame, that would cause a default. Red loses. What if red applies an illegal hold during this pinning situation and it's his fourth illegal hold of that match? Again, he would be disqualified. What if the ref notices that red's shoelace is untied after red had previously received a 2-point stalling penalty? That would mean red is disqualified because now he's gotten too many stall penalties. What if red needed a second H&C timeout during this time frame while he's pinning his opponent? He would lose by default. What if green commits a violation that would disqualify him? He gouges the eyes of the offensive wrestler while he's getting pinned or does something flagrant. What's the final result? Is the final result that red only gets the tech fall because the match ends with the tech fall, or would red get the disqualification and instead of getting 5 team points for a tech fall, get 16 points? And then finally, what if green needs a charged timeout? That would create a default. So green requests a third injury timeout or has already exhausted their blood time of 5 minutes during the match and now starts bleeding again. Any of those things would cause a default. But the question is, what's the final result of the match? Does green win by tech fall, or does green win by default in that case? So the rules do not provide a clear answer to any of those things, and this is where we have a problem. Referees could see the same situation and come up with a different result of the match, and potentially a different winner if we had the situation where red is the one who is committing a violation or doing an act that results either in disqualification or defaulting. Let's look at the delayed stoppage example. And here again, where the rules sort of don't give us a clear answer. What if either wrestler commits a flagrant misconduct during this extended time that we continue the wrestling? What if either wrestler needs a charged timeout that would create a default, a third injury timeout or a blood time out where the 5 minutes had already been exhausted, or a second H&C timeout? What happens if either wrestler commits a fourth violation that would disqualify them, a fourth illegal hold, a fourth unnecessary roughness? Who wins the match? Because we already supposedly had somebody earning the tech fall, but now we keep wrestling, and in the bad time where something happens that would potentially change who the winner of the match is. So let's go back to, when does a match actually begin? Well, there are rules in place that define that. Rule 6-2-2 that talks about when wrestlers are supposed to report in what order, and Rule 5-17 defines the match start and end. Problem with the existing rules is that, number one, there isn't really anything that defines when the wrestler is truly committed to the wrestling match. So that means in the scenario I painted where they might report into the table, they're not required to report. They can do something that they might get a violation or a timeout charged to them, and then they could be withdrawn before any of the wrestling starts, and it would wipe that stuff away. Secondly, The match technically starts at a different time for each competitor, and the rules as they're currently configured don't really explicitly acknowledge that reality, and they don't operate under that reality. So when does a match conclude? Well, your key rules that define the different kind of outcomes, like decision, default, disqualification, etc., are listed here. But what are the problems here? Like you saw in my illustration, there are some situations that involve continuation of wrestling, even though somebody's already earned the victory. And then something problematic happens where during that time frame that the wrestling is allowed to continue, it could change the match result, and it could even change theoretically who's winning the match. Also, we could have a match where there is a final result achieved, but we continue wrestling by mistake and have bad time. And again, there are some events which don't get wiped out by bad time. And so if we don't void those events, it muddies what is the real final result of the match. So now let's look at some proposed solutions to changing the rules here. First, we got to define with certainty when the match has ended in every situation. There is ambiguity in some of the situations I've highlighted where literally we could say red wins, nope, green wins now. So we can't have that. Second, we need to codify the principle that once somebody has earned the victory, there is no opportunity whatsoever for the opponent to win that match. So if we've hit that marker that somebody earned the victory, there's no way in the world that the other person should be able to win the match. But we also need to codify the principle that rulings have to take place in the order that the events happen. Believe me, officials still get confused about this, and so we just need to write it into the rule book. It has to be in the rule somewhere that you rule in the order things happened. Fourth thing is, I would say that there's a potential exception to that last principle, which could be this. Number one, the victor should get the best result available when we stop the wrestling. So they may earn, like, easy example, they've earned a tech fall, but because they're pinning the opponent, and if they complete the pin, they actually get the pin instead of the tech fall. So they're getting the best result. But what happens if they're pinning the opponent and now the opponent cries out for their third injury timeout and we stop action because of that, short of the pin? If we rule in order, we would say, well, the tech fall happened and then they cried out for injury, but since the tech fall already happened, all you get is a technical fall. You don't get a default. So we just need to, write in to the rules potentially an exception that says when the action stops, you get the best result available to you. Other possible exception could be for flagrant misconduct. This is like the highest sin that you can commit in the sport. And so if we're wrestling and we haven't stopped the wrestling match yet, even if we keep wrestling in error, so bad time, we should have stopped the match, but we didn't. If you commit a flagrant misconduct, perhaps we should consider saying that gets applied first. I don't care that you earned the victory. If you do a flagrant misconduct at any moment when we think the wrestling match is still in progress, you lose. Your opponent wins. Something to consider. So here's the change to the rule 5-17 that I would propose. So the current rule reads this way. Rule 5-17-2. A match begins when the proper wrestler reports to the scores table in dual matches and tournaments until the conclusion of wrestling. The conclusion of wrestling occurs when the time expires at the end of the third period, when the overtime ends, or when a fall, technical fall, disqualification, or default occurs. So there's too much looseness in how that's defined. So let's revise Article 2 this way to focus only on the start of the match. So I would rewrite Article 2 this way. The match begins for a wrestler when any of the following are true for that wrestler. 1. They report to the scores table and cannot be withdrawn without losing the match by disqualification. That's the situation where once they've reported in the proper order, they can no longer be withdrawn. So They're committed, basically. 2, second part, referee initiates a charged timeout. So if that wrestler has hit the table and reported in, and then suddenly the referee has to initiate a charged timeout because that person is bleeding or requires injury time or something, then match has now started for that person. Third, wrestler does something that results in recording a scoring symbol in the scorebook or score sheet. So they reported in, they weren't ready to wrestle, they were wearing a wristwatch, or they didn't have their mouth guard or something. And now the official has issued a technical violation, which now needs to get recorded on the score sheet against that wrestler. That means the match has already begun for that wrestler. There's no withdrawing them at that point. And then lastly, that the whistle blows to initiate wrestling action. So they came out, they both reported, they came out to the mat, and once that whistle's blown, nobody can get withdrawn. The match has started for them both definitely at that point. Okay, so this change to the rule is intended to define with clarity exactly that moment that the match begins for an individual wrestler. Because again, the match does start at a different time for each wrestler. All right. The second change to Rule 5-17 is to define end of match more precisely. So I'm going to propose a new Article 3, so 5-17-3. This would be brand new language. The match concludes when any of the following occur. First one, time expires at the end of any period and a wrestler has earned a victory by decision. So actually, to be honest with you, the decision is not really defined in the rulebook precisely. So we would also need to define exactly what a decision is. But if it's the end of the third period, or it's the end of sudden victory and somebody has more points, or end of any of the overtime periods where somebody has more points and now the end of that period is what signals the end of wrestling and they're winning by decision, that's the first situation. Match concludes anytime the decision happens, right? Second is a fall has been achieved. Third, wrestler is disqualified. Fourth, a default is declared by the referee. And the fifth is scoring concludes for any wrestling actions allowed by rule following the moment when a victory has been earned for, and 2 sub-points here, a first score happening in any overtime period in which the first score wins the match. That covers your sudden victory, where first point scored win, or your ultimate tiebreaker, where first point scored win. Secondly, a technical fall. So in the technical fall scenario, or in the first score scenario, what can happen is the wrestler has secured their victory by scoring, but the scoring is taking the opponent into near fall criteria, so we're allowing wrestling to continue. And until that near fall situation has ended or resolved itself, wrestling can continue. Okay, so once that situation concludes, though, the scoring has concluded for that. That's the only reason we would let the wrestling continue, is because they are in the process of potentially scoring a fall and getting a better victory than the one that they have earned to that point. Then once that scoring situation is concluded, action stops, wrestling match is over. Okay. Now, other part of this rule is where we'll codify that we have to do things in order. So the language is, rulings shall be recorded in the order that events happened. Scoring symbols may be recorded in the scorebook/score sheet within the match only for rulings applied to events that happened after the match begins and before the match concluded. So we have to draw very strict boundaries around what constitutes the beginning and end of match, and make sure nobody tries to insert something inside of those boundaries that didn't happen between the start and end. For example, we had a problem at our state tournament last year where the official wanted to penalize a wrestler for a technical violation after the match had already ended. And that should never have happened. So this language is intended to say you can't do that. It would have guided more clearly that you're trying to put a scoring symbol inside of the third period. Too late. The third period already ended, and now you're looking at an act that happened after the third period concluded and trying to call that a violation that gets inserted into the third period. Can't do it. Exception. This is where we want to try to accommodate, what happens after you've earned the victory, but you have the potential to get, a better result. So exception, when action continues after a technical fall or first score victory has been earned, the wrestler earning the victory will receive the highest final result possible at the moment the referee stops action. So this would cover a situation such as, I've already earned my tech fall, I'm pinning you, we're letting wrestling continue, and at that point, your opponent, the defensive wrestler, defaults. They cry out for their third injury timeout. They pass out, and they've already had an HNC timeout. So at any rate, now this wrestler that earned a tech fall or a first score victory because they got the takedown in sudden victory or because they got a reversal in ultimate tiebreaker and they're pinning their opponent, they now get the better victory, which is the pinfall or the default. And then this is the thing that we want to also codify, that we're doing rulings in order. So that's what this exception's saying, is when we did rulings in order, you got your technical fall, theoretically the match might have been over, but we're saying not really if you were able to get a better victory. It's over if your opponent suddenly started to score or did something that you thought, well, the opponent might win the match because the opponent somehow turned it around and pinned you, or you pinned yourself. Nope. That's not going to happen because that's not a better victory for the person who earned the victory. So that's why this is an exception. The other possible exception I would put up for consideration, if flagrant misconduct occurs while the match is in progress, even during bad time, the penalty for this violation shall supersede any other rulings, regardless of the sequence of events. So just, you may have earned your technical fall, or you may have gotten the takedown in sudden victory that took your opponent straight into near fall criteria. If you commit a flagrant misconduct while you're pinning this person, you lose, they win. That's what this exception would be about. It's intended to make the flagrant misconduct the worst of all possible violations, and that you pay the dearest price possible as a discouragement to anyone to ever think about doing a flagrant misconduct. Okay, so that's the proposal.